You're standing on the footpath outside your grandmother's old house, and even before you push open the little wooden gate, you already know exactly what's waiting for you. The red brick glowing warm in the afternoon light, the wide veranda stretching across the front, held up by thick brick columns. A stained glass panel above the front door throwing a small colored square of red and amber onto the hallway floor whenever the sun hit it right. You know which floorboard creaks before you even step on it. That house wasn't just where your grandmother lived. It was a shape burned into your memory, and it's a shape nobody builds anymore. Before we go any further, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments what style house you grew up in. If you're old enough to remember visiting a house like that as a child, you were standing inside a piece of Australian design history that had already, without anyone quite announcing it, started disappearing. To understand what happened to these houses, you have to go right back to the beginning of the 20th century, to the years just after Federation in 1901, when Australia had only just become a single nation rather than 6 separate colonies, and there was a genuine hunger for a way of building that felt distinctly Australian rather than borrowed wholesale from Britain. This was the Federation style, and it is almost certainly the house your grandmother, or her mother before her, grew up in. Red brick facades, stained glass windows catching the light in the hallway and above the front door, steeply pitched roofs finished in slate or terracotta tiles, a picket fence out front holding back a small, tidy garden. Architects of the period were, for the first time, genuinely designing with the harsh Australian climate in mind rather than simply copying a British pattern book, and the result was a style that felt proud of where it actually was. In Queensland and parts of New South Wales, that same Federation confidence took on its own regional character. The Queenslander, raised up high on timber stumps to catch the breeze and avoid the damp, with elaborate timber fretwork screens across the veranda that did double duty as decoration and as a way of shading the house and letting air circulate through the heat. That fretwork was sometimes so intricate it looked like lacework carved directly into timber, and an entire style within the style, sometimes called Federation filigree, grew up simply around how elaborate you could make that veranda screen. Then, sometime around the First World War, the style began to soften and simplify into something called the Edwardian bungalow, a transitional house that still had the stained glass and the decorative touches of Federation, but with a plainer, more restrained silhouette, a single prominent gable facing the street, walls more often clad in notched weatherboard than solid brick. It was a house style that existed, almost by design, for barely a decade or two, a bridge between one grand idea and the next one waiting just around the corner. And the next one arrived from about as far away as it was possible to come. Through the 1920s and into the 1930s, Australians fell in love with California, or at least with the version of it flickering across cinema screens in the new picture theaters springing up in every town, and a style called the Californian bungalow swept through the suburbs almost as fast as the films that inspired it. You can spot one instantly even now. A low, wide roofline with deep overhanging eaves, sometimes clad in timber shingles. Thick brick or rendered brick columns holding up a generous front veranda, built specifically for sitting outside on a warm evening. Lead light windows with geometric patterns rather than the pictorial stained glass of the Federation years. Exposed timber brackets under the eaves. Half timbering worked into the gable ends. A warm, relaxed, sun-drenched feeling that suited the Australian climate every bit as well as it had suited Southern California. For about 15 years, this was the house every young Australian family aspired to build. A little piece of imported glamour reshaped to sit comfortably on a suburban block in Brisbane or Melbourne or Perth. Through the interwar years there were other, smaller fashions too, an Old English or Tudor revival look favoured by some families, with decorative half-timbering and steep, storybook gables that made a suburban house look faintly like an English cottage transplanted into the gum trees, and a Spanish mission style with rendered arches and terracotta roof tiles for families chasing a slightly different kind of romantic escape. None of these styles lasted especially long, but each one left its own small, distinctive fingerprints scattered across Australian suburbs, houses you can still pick out on a street today simply by the shape of a gable or the curve of an archway. Then came the war, and after the war, almost overnight, everything about how Australian houses were built changed completely. Through the Second World War, raw materials like steel, timber, and even bricks were tightly rationed, kept back for the war effort, and it wasn't really until the mid-1950s that supply caught up with the enormous pent-up demand for housing. Returning servicemen and their new young families needed homes urgently, and the government stepped in with a war service home scheme to help make that possible, which meant, for the first time in Australian history, housing needed to be produced not as one-off, individually detailed projects but at genuine scale, fast, and as affordably as the young families buying them could manage. This is the exact moment the story bends, the same way it always seems to bend in these things. The very success of getting ordinary Australian families into their own homes after the war is what quietly ended the era of the individually crafted, richly detailed house. Volume building companies began to appear, offering a small handful of standard floor plans that could be built over and over again across an entire new suburb. And one name more than any other came to define that shift, a company called A.V. Jennings. Early Jennings homes through the 1950s were plain, practical brick veneer rectangles, a straightforward pitched roof running down the center, built to be affordable and quick rather than beautiful. By the early 1960s, the double or triple fronted cream brick veneer house, with its cement tiled roof and a staggered, stepped facade, had become the single most recognizable house shape in the entire country, repeated block after block, street after street, all across the new outer suburbs opening up in every capital city. Before brick veneer fully took over, though, an enormous number of Australian families in the immediate post-war years were housed in something a great deal humbler, a lightweight cement sheet called fibro, cut into flat panels and nailed onto a simple timber frame. Fibro houses went up fast and cheap right across the outer suburbs and along the coast in these lean years, holiday shacks and permanent family homes alike, and for a long time the material carried a slightly embarrassing, lower-rung reputation precisely because it was so obviously the affordable option, a house you built when brick was still out of reach. It would take decades before fibro beach shacks themselves became fashionable, sought after by exactly the kind of buyer who once would have turned their nose up at one. A.V. Jennings wasn't alone in shaping the new outer suburbs either. Other project builders carved out their own piece of the market through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, companies like Pettit and Sevitt, who became known for a more architecturally considered style of project home built around courtyards and exposed brick and timber, proving that volume building and genuine design quality weren't always mutually exclusive, even if the cheaper, plainer brick veneer box remained by far the more common sight on an ordinary suburban street. Display home villages became their own strange, specific piece of Australian suburban culture through this period too. Entire streets of project builders show homes built side by side purely so a young couple could walk from one display to the next on a Saturday afternoon, comparing floor plans and carpet samples and kitchen benchtop finishes before ever committing to a block of their own. You remember being dragged along to one of these as a kid, bored senseless walking through somebody else's imaginary furniture while your parents debated whether the family room should face the street or the backyard. And how strange it felt that every single display home smelled exactly the same, a mix of fresh paint and new carpet that never quite existed anywhere else. That triple-fronted brick veneer became so completely woven into Australian suburban identity that decades later the artist Howard Arkley would build much of his career painting exactly this kind of house in electric, almost lurid color, turning the plainest, most ordinary brick veneer box in the country into something worth hanging in a gallery. Which tells you something important. The house had become so ordinary, so universally familiar to every Australian who grew up anywhere near a new outer suburb, that it needed an artist to make people look at it properly again. And it kept evolving through the 60s and 70s, roofs growing lower and more angular, brick colors shifting from cream through to warm oranges and deep browns, aluminium-framed windows replacing timber ones, split-level designs and sunken lounge rooms appearing as families wanted more relaxed, informal living spaces. But the essential idea, a project home, chosen from a small catalogue of standard designs, built quickly and affordably by a large company rather than shaped individually by an architect for one particular family, never really went away again. It only kept refining itself into whatever the display home village was selling that particular decade. There's a genuine irony sitting in the middle of all this that's worth pausing on properly. Every single one of the earlier styles, Federation, Californian bungalow, Old English, existed because Australia had reached a level of prosperity and confidence where individual families could commission or choose a house with real character, a house that said something specific about who they were. The brick veneer boom that replaced all of it was driven by exactly the same impulse, prosperity, just at a far larger scale, spread across many more families than ever before. It wasn't a decline in Australian ambition that killed the ornate old styles. It was success, democratized so widely and so quickly that the individual craftsmanship simply couldn't keep pace with the sheer number of houses the country suddenly needed to build. Which meant the older styles, the Federation homes with their stained glass and picket fences, the Californian bungalows with their fat brick columns and deep verandas, simply stopped being what anyone built new. They didn't vanish overnight the way a toy or a phone network might. They kept standing, quietly, all across the older established suburbs, while every new outer suburb around them filled up with brick veneer instead. And slowly, the individual houses themselves began to change too, in ways that chipped away at what had once made them so distinctive. Verandas got enclosed to create an extra bedroom or a sunroom, and once glass and brick filled in that open space, the whole proportion of the house's face changed forever. Fretwork and decorative timber brackets, considered fussy and old-fashioned by families chasing a more modern look, were pulled down and thrown away, sometimes burned in the backyard incinerator on a Saturday afternoon along with the rest of the week's rubbish. Stained and lead-light windows were knocked out and replaced with plain aluminium sliders because they let in more light and cost less to replace when a ball went through them. Pressed metal ceilings, once a proud feature of a Federation dining room, got covered over with a flat modern sheet because the old ornamental pattern was thought to collect dust and look dated. Wide corner blocks that had once held one grand Californian bungalow with a deep garden were split in half and sold off, with a second, smaller house squeezed in beside the original, changing the whole rhythm of a street that had taken decades to establish. If you were a kid in one of these houses in the 60s or 70s, before any of that renovating had happened yet, you remember exactly what it felt like to actually live inside one. The wide hallway of a Federation home, dark and cool even in the middle of summer, running straight from the front door to the kitchen at the back, so long you could hear your mother calling you from one end while you were still pulling your shoes off at the other. The particular creak of a Californian bungalow's veranda boards under bare feet on a hot afternoon, worn smooth and silvery by decades of sun. The high ceilings that made every room feel bigger than it actually was, and the single bare light bulb hanging in the hallway that somehow never seemed bright enough no matter what wattage your father put in it. You knew which door stuck in winter and needed a shoulder to open it. You knew exactly how far you could run down that long hallway before you had to slow down or skid straight into the kitchen table. The garden mattered just as much as the house itself. A Californian bungalow almost always came with a wide front veranda built specifically for sitting outside in the evening once the heat of the day had broken, your grandfather in a cane chair with a beer, the fly screen door banging shut behind anyone who went in or out for something from the kitchen, fruit trees out the back, a lemon tree by the back fence, a Hills hoist standing in the middle of the yard like the flagpole of the whole property, the whole afternoon organized loosely around whoever was hanging out washing or mowing the small strip of buffalo grass with a push mower that took real effort to get moving. Further back in the older Federation and Victorian houses, before indoor plumbing had fully caught up with the rest of the house, the toilet itself was often still a separate little structure standing well away from the back door, a small brick or timber outhouse Australians simply called the dunny, connected to nothing more than a can that a council worker, the dunny man, would collect and replace on his rounds each week. Even once proper sewerage reached most suburbs through the middle of the century, plenty of older Federation and bungalow homes kept that separate outdoor toilet standing in the backyard for years afterward, sometimes repurposed as a garden shed once it was no longer needed for its original job, a small brick reminder of just how recently indoor plumbing had actually arrived. Inside, a Federation kitchen was a genuinely separate room at the very back of the house, often with its own small rear veranda beside it for the ice chest before refrigeration arrived properly, a wood or early gas stove standing against one wall, and a scrubbed timber table in the middle rather than the open-plan island bench of a modern build. Californian bungalow kitchens through the 20s and 30s began to modernize a little faster, built-in cupboards starting to appear along one wall, a meat safe with its fine wire mesh doors keeping the flies off before refrigerators became affordable for an ordinary family. The bathroom, similarly, was often a fairly basic, utilitarian little room compared to the rest of the house, a clawfoot bath, a small high-set window with frosted or lead-like glass for privacy, black and white hexagonal floor tiles that, decades later, would themselves become fashionable all over again in a completely different renovating era, because it wasn't only about how the house looked from the street. It was about the very texture of childhood inside it, the particular hallway, the particular veranda, the particular creak in the particular floorboard, and none of it transferred easily into whatever came afterwards. A woman wrote once online that her family's Federation home had its original lead light front door replaced sometime in the 1970s with a plain flush door because her father thought it let in too much cold air, and that she didn't fully understand what had actually been lost until she saw a photograph of the original door decades later in a real estate archive and simply sat with it for a long while. Another person remembered the fretwork veranda on their grandparents' Queenslander being torn down entirely in the 80s to make way for aluminium security screens, and how strange it felt, decades later, to see the exact same pattern of fretwork suddenly fashionable again, sold as a heritage feature by renovators trying to put back exactly what an earlier generation had thrown away. Because that's really the last turn in this story. These older styles, the ones nobody was building anymore by the middle of the century, slowly became the very thing renovators and heritage councils fight hardest to protect today. Whole pockets of Federation and Californian bungalow homes are now covered by heritage overlays, protected by local councils specifically so a new owner can't do to them what an earlier generation did without a second thought. Original lead light windows, once ripped out for letting in a draft, are now carefully restored and insured. Veranda fretwork, once burned in the backyard, is now painstakingly recreated by specialist joiners working from old photographs, at a cost that would have horrified the family who tore the original down in the first place. Entire suburbs built up almost entirely of Federation and bungalow homes, places that once seemed simply old-fashioned and unremarkable, are now marketed by real estate agents specifically for their period character. Streetscapes protected block by block precisely because whole rows of them survived together, untouched, largely by accident rather than any grand plan to preserve them. Councils now issue detailed heritage guidelines advising homeowners on the correct pitch for a replacement roof or the historically accurate color to repaint a timber fretwork screen, a level of bureaucratic care that would have seemed utterly bewildering to a family in 1962 quietly modernizing their windows on a Saturday morning without asking anybody's permission at all. And the brick veneer project home, the plain triple-fronted box that had once felt like the death of individual character in Australian housing, has quietly become its own object of nostalgia too. The exact childhood home an entire generation of Australians grew up in during the 70s and 80s, remembered now with the same warmth their grandparents once felt for the Federation homes it had replaced. Somewhere in you there is still a version of that walk up your grandmother's front path, the gate creaking the same particular way it always creaked, the coloured square of light from the stained glass landing on the hallway floor exactly where it always landed, a whole style of being Australian folded into brick and timber and glass that nobody, not even the biggest project home company in the country, has ever quite managed to build again. Drive through any older established suburb today and you can still read the whole history in a single street if you know what you're looking for. A Federation home with its stained glass intact sitting 2 doors down from one that lost its veranda to an ugly 70s renovation. A Californian bungalow with its original fretwork carefully restored, sitting directly across the road from a triple-fronted brick veneer built the same year the last bungalow went up nearby, the two of them representing two completely different ideas about what an Australian home should look like, standing close enough to share a fence line. That's the real inheritance of this whole story, not any single style winning out over the others, but an entire visible timeline of Australian ambition and affordability, argued out in brick and timber, still standing on ordinary streets for anyone patient enough to walk down them and actually look. If you grew up in a Federation home, a Californian bungalow, a Queenslander, or the classic triple-fronted brick veneer, tell us in the comments. What was your childhood house, and does it still exist?